Francoise, it's been fabulous over the last couple of weeks, I have to say, while I've been in Cairns, to have met you and to have been able to talk, come and see you installing, and to begin to talk to you about your life, your work, and the show itself, which we'll talk about in a second. But just first of all, about yourself. Obviously, you're a Torres Strait Island woman. You identify both as Miriam and Correg, if that's correct. And you are an artist, you are a designer, and latterly also now a curator. It would be just great to hear your story as to what led to all this.
Wow. I have always had a creative heart. As a young girl, I would be creating Lego, drawing. I was always trying to rearrange my mother's house. So this creative spirit of mine has always been there. And I think just having an outlet for growing up in a culturally mixed family, being an Indigenous woman, but also having this beautiful Irish family as well, there was a lot to process. And I can look back and go, I wasn't thinking about the complexity of it at that time, but in my work that I produced from being a child in primary to going into high school, dabbled into those feelings around that. As a young designer, I have had the opportunity to work with Indigenous people, with Indigenous communities, and that was from early on when I first left uni and got a job in Queensland Housing, and that was in the Indigenous design unit of Queensland Housing. So it was a long time ago, but we were pushing new design values within the office as young Indigenous designers, and there weren't many of us back then. You could count them on one hand. So it was a very new area to be in. And I have looked beyond what was, I guess, presented as what you did when you graduated from uni as an interior designer in the built environment. I looked beyond what was being offered in general practice, because I wanted to do more, and I wanted to do more for my people, and I wanted to have impact change for how my people, and I say that thinking of my family in the Straits, yep, how they lived, the type of housing they lived in. So I was able to bring some small changes into the delivery of social housing into remote Indigenous communities of Queensland, right up to the Straits.
And now, so it was after Queensland Housing that you then started your own practice?
Oh, that was many years later.
Right.
So
there was lots happening in between.
Well, there was. So in my first job, which was with Queensland Housing in the Indigenous Studies unit, I ended up becoming romantically involved with one of the other young Indigenous architects, who he was a student at that time. So we ended up getting married. Right. And so we had a journey together. I mean, we've been married 25 years now. So I had to think about that. How many years have we been married? 25 years. So we met at Indigenous Housing unit, and then we ended up leaving there to take a journey through Alice Springs, and with work opportunities that Andrew had. Right. During that period, I raised our family. Right. So we had 2 children out in Alice Springs. We had one in Brisbane. And while we were out there, we just built a really strong family unit. I was a long way from saltwater, which was so difficult. It was so difficult to be so far from my family in the Torres Strait. I had been fortunate to go back up fairly frequently in years before, but while we were out there being on single income, it was just a real growing time and strengthening in, I guess.
And did you have much time yourself for your own practice at that time?
I devoted a lot of time to my family during that period, but I was fortunate enough to pick up some interior design jobs. Right. So these were ones that really appealed to me. So I worked on a couple of residential projects where it was working with extensions and interior design with that. Right. I also designed a visitors centre for Karma radios.
Oh, yes.
So that was a beautiful job. So fantastic. That was the first interior design project where embedding country, I wouldn't have called it that then, but that's exactly what that process was about. Right. We embedded country into the design, even to the point of having rammed earth walls that formed part of the display wall, and Indigenous led. So I worked with 2 of the senior female members of Karma at the time, and to design this visitors centre.
And that's become very much a signature part of what you and Andrew do, isn't it? Now?
That's right. So in our projects, we really value that process of understanding what the client desires, we absolutely enjoy working with Indigenous clients and clients who value Indigenous content being brought into the design. Right. We absolutely enjoy that, especially when the client is open to talking with First Nations people and those traditional owners of that country, that site.
Yep. So you ended up in Cairns?
In Cairns, I was working with architects as a consultant interior designer on projects, and I did that as, dependent on the type of project it was, it had to intrigue me. I wanted to work on those projects because I could see that I could bring value to it, but also that it would, feed my soul. One of the projects that I worked on was for Arab engineers and project managers, and I fitted out an interior of theirs not long after we moved here, and that was a really fun project to do. And because they're an internationally renowned practice engineering organisation, it was important to capture just who they were on an international context. So there was I had a lot of fun working on that project, and it really grew me as well. I hadn't worked with a client that had such respect and having to think about their branding internationally and then incorporate that into the interiors was a great opportunity.
Fantastic experience. So tell me how, because you ended up doing a few years ago, you did the British Council Accelerate program, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
How did that come about, and what was when you got on that program, which I understand is a leadership program very much? Why did you do that, and what were you hoping to get out of it, and what did you get out of it?
So the Accelerate leadership program is for high achieving Indigenous creatives and professionals. The program was shared with me with another mutual architect friend of mine who said, "Fran, you should look at this program. I think it's for you." So that was how I found out about Accelerate. So it's wonderful having, connections of women and within the field and who know your work and who know what, sometimes they can see more of you than what you see of your own, just what you're doing and how relevant or how important it is. And so my friend said, take a look at it. So I did. And Accelerate offered an experience, a cultural experience and leadership experience in the UK. So it was a curated experience to grow your, like, almost like your worldview of the practice that you operate in. And then they had supported leadership training within that. So I worked with Mark Wright in the area of leadership, and this was as a group of 6 creative professionals. And he took us through different leadership styles, which most of us were familiar with. But I think one of the main takes from that leadership intensive was that my creative practice is diverse. Yeah. So, I can be a curator, I can be an artist, I can be a designer. Even as an artist, because I like to move and create wherever my heart takes me to express, I don't want to define myself as a printmaker or as a sculptor of reclaimed fish netting. I don't want to define what my practice is. I don't want to define that I can design good furniture or do art. So I am all of these, and that's okay. Yeah. I can't be boxed. Yes. And I don't have to be, and I won't. So it allowed me to see that I give myself permission to not be boxed.
Yes. This is who I am, and if you don't like it, world, particularly art world, design world, and everything else, then that is it. That is who I am.
This is who I am, and I'm happy with that, and happy to share it. Happy to share that love that I have for so many different aspects of my creating with others.
And the reason, creating with others, is the reason that I've brought that program up, because I noticed that in Cairns you are also part of another exhibition, which is with Scottish artists, correct?
That's right, Emily Millichip.
Yep, and with a design that is actually in prototype at the moment for a very funky backpack that everybody in Cairns is talking about, wanting to go into production. So
wonderful.
How did that come about?
So I met with Emily whilst on the UK Accelerate experience. She was a designer that in my Instagram, we follow lots of people on Insta, I had come across her work and I thought, wow, this woman is very interesting. And I had seen that she had a real eye for detail with the products that she produced. She had this great sense of humour in delivering and talking about her work, which is always I think an endearing quality, because it means you don't take yourself too seriously either, but she also presented as a very professional creative artist maker. Yep. So on the Accelerate, I identified that I'd like to meet with Emily and see what drives her creative practice and talk to her about that. I was working, I'm working in developing textiles for interiors, and we had some similarities there, but I thought it'd be great to just meet with her. And it's just one of those, out of all the different names that could have come up, she wasn't like one of the more bigger known names in textile design, but she was doing great things and doing excellent collaborations. And I thought, there might be potential here for something. So I met with Emily in her studio in Edinburgh on a very cold, wintry day.
One of the many.
Nothing like the tropics. So when she came out to collect me from the waiting area, she was wearing tropical clothing and totally contrasting to the grey of the outside, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a cracker. So, and we chatted like we knew each other,
Yeah.
So she had done a previous degree in anthropology, in the study of Indigenous beliefs. So she was very fascinated with Indigenous cultures.
Right.
So we just started talking. We just had so much in common that went beyond creating textiles and creating soft furnishings for interiors or clothing. So it was just
Partnership made in heaven.
a partnership made in heaven, and we decided that we had to do something together, which the following year I was successful in securing funding from Australia Council through the British Council
Yep.
to do a collaborative project. And they were also after promoting connections made through the Accelerate program.
Right.
Because of that, we both thought through, both Emily and I, we thought through how do we make the most of the connections made during that program.
Fantastic opportunity.
Hence the fabrics being
Yep.
printed in the Glasgow School of Arts
Yes.
from Centre for Advanced
Yes.
Textiles.
When we decided to do WOW in Cairns, and we were going to do WOW at the tanks, we discovered that Tank 4 was already booked and had an exhibition in. And we kept saying, nobody at that stage knew what the Kayak exhibition was going to be. And when we discovered that the Kayak exhibition was going to be this exhibition curated by two women, yourself and artistic director of Kayak, Janina Harding, and it was called Where's Your Permit? We decided to investigate more, thinking, gosh, this is a story that potentially has some incredible connection back to many of the values that WOW, Women of the World, hold as an organisation and what we try to do within a festival. So we thought, no, let's look into this a little bit more, and we're delighted to find this remarkable story, and that's the story I'd love you to tell me as to where did it come from?
Yeah, the concept for Where's Your Permit started on country. For the last 4 years, I've made a commitment to go back onto Kuriri, onto my family block, and that's on Hammond Island in the Torres Strait. And I spend time there on my artist sabbatical, and I just create art, and I live on the block and in the house that my ate, my grandfather, that he built with his own hands during the time of the protectionist era. And when I'm on country, I'm processing what my family lived through, how they survived, how they were so resilient to what was thrown at them during this time, and their ingenuity of how to, I wouldn't say thrive, because they didn't do that, but how they survived that time.
And for those who don't know, because my understanding from the conversations we've had is that many people don't know, what was the protectionist era?
So the protectionist era is a shortened name for the time when Queensland Indigenous peoples lived under the protection of Aboriginals and restriction of the sale of opium. Living during this time was, for Indigenous people, was just a real horrible time where your human rights didn't exist. I mean, you weren't seen as humans during this time either. You were fauna. So it was a horrible time, and individuals could be moved at the will of the superintendent of that day without reason, but just because that was the power that they held under that act. So my family suffered greatly under this act, and I don't have the permission to share the story of that, so I won't. When I'm on country, on my family's block. I look around, the block is being lovingly kept and restored by my Uncle Peter Sabatino. He sees in a similar way to me that the material culture on the site is sacred. And so he has been uncovering material culture from those days of surviving on that country. I had talked to him about the relevance of the stories in our family from on that block of survival and of the ingenuity. There's a lot to celebrate. That's been my focus in processing that history of the block. You know, how do I celebrate the good things? And that has led to other family members of my generation coming onto the block and celebrating in that same way. So we're making new memories on the block, which is something that brings healing to us, and it also helps process the history of the place. So I had spoken with my uncle about how can I bring about the message of processing what it is to live through this time, because there's incredible stories to be told. How can I do that and allow others to tell their story? Because there has to be more people than just me who want to share the truth. Not everyone's going to be able to do that for varying reasons, because it is a time that is, you know, there's so much trauma and ongoing trauma and inherited trauma for people my age and younger still, from the effects of those rules in that act. But I thought, how can we allow others to tell their story who want to? Because surely that will bring some healing, maybe. Or, you know, it's just so good to share the truth.
And did that particular time that you were back on country coincide with COVID? Or
yes, it did.
So that coincided with the lockdowns and everything, and that's what led to you thinking.
Yes, that's right. So whilst on country, I mean, we've been very fortunate up here in Cairns that our lockdown was only for, 4 to 6 weeks, I think it was. Right. So we've been very fortunate in our movements up here. I guess the premise for the exhibition was to bring about a common ground for Australians living with the restrictions of movement because of COVID versus the restrictions on movement that were on the Indigenous people during the time of the Act. And also just recognising that the lockdowns that we had up here triggered trauma from living under the Act, because our elders, today lived through that period, and the restrictions went beyond someone being able to, say where you could live and where you could be moved to. It went beyond that. So it was, I thought it was the time to provide a common ground to the broader Australia to look at, okay, we're having restrictions at the moment because it's for the greater good of our society to limit the spread of COVID. What happens when restrictions are not for the greater good and they're based on a paternalistic government of the day? What happens?
That's a real opportunity for such a significant conversation. And then you went about pulling the exhibition together through an open call-out. Was that correct?
It was a select invite. So, but quite broad. We, Kaya always invites remote Indigenous community art centres to submit works. So this was something that we did. So we made that invitation to all of those art centres.
Right.
We also invited independent artists to submit works for the exhibition. I, as an independent artist myself, I was very keen to provide that opportunity for both areas to present work, and I thought that way we would get really strong pieces between the two groups to present.
So how many artists are in the exhibition?
There's approximately 30 artists in the exhibition. We have 5 art centres, and the area of where the artists operate from extend from Ereb in the Torres Strait through Cape communities of Pomperow, Hopevale, down to our region of Yarrabah, and artists within this area and south of Cairns. And we have one artist contributing from Brisbane also.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. But it's very much, very much a response to the concept from artists within this particular region.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And we felt it was really important to emphasise that this was an invitation that's no strings attached. It's voluntary because of the title, Where's Your Permit? And when Janina and I were talking about what could the title be, we wanted it to be provocative. I think the title, Where's Your Permit, is provocative. And we wanted the viewer, we hoped that in the way that we presented the artworks, that the viewer would go beyond what looks beautiful in the art, but read the stories, take the time to contemplate the unwritten. I think there's a lot of power in what is not said. And we've also allowed for those who want to deep dive more into what it was to live under the Act, we have links to the full versions of those 2 acts.
Yes.
So this is part of Queensland's history. It's not often talked about, but the effects of the government's decisions of that day continue to affect the generations today.
And one of the tremendous things I think about the exhibition is not just obviously the narrative and what is being said and what is here in terms of each of the individual artists' works, but it's the fact of how you have designed the space and designed the exhibition. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, because it's a little different than you might find in a usual box gallery.
Absolutely. Previous exhibitions in the space have always followed like a grid plan of some sort. The lighting is set up to best accentuate the walls aligned on that grid. For this exhibition, we're all about not being contained within a grid, within a set way. And that's how we presented. We need to bring change to this, and the best way to do that is to indigenise the space, to indigenise how we positioned the walls and in the plan layout, to consider Indigenous design values, which my design practice with my husband, Indig Design, we've done so much work around this. I could draw upon experiences there around behavioural or cultural behavioural rules to inform how I laid out the wall design.
And the way in which people approach the exhibition.
That's right.
How they can walk around the exhibition and how how they can experience the exhibition.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So the art centres from up in the Cape, they have those cultural avoidance behaviours that needed to be accommodated for because they're exhibiting, their artists are exhibiting here. So part of that involves having clear lines of sight around the space so that if you need to avoid a sister-in-law or a mother-in-law, then you can see them and make a way to avoid crossing them in that space. And it allows for, I mean, the aim is to make the space feel or to be safe and welcoming. And the best way to do that is to consider some of those Indigenous design values. We had a meeting with Chris Stannard, and we being Tiho Ropian from Kayaf and myself, and Chris was telling us the usual layouts for the exhibition space and that the grid system worked best because the lights were on a grid system, the artworks were lit up best when they're on a grid system. And I was looking at Chris and listening to him, and I thought, it's not going to be on a grid system. So I spoke about how the Where's Your Permit is all about not being constrained, and that this is the perfect time to do something that's off the grid. And really, it was about indigenising the space, and this was the perfect time to do it.
Fantastic.
So in indigenising the space, what I think of as a designer is how we embed Indigenous design values into the space that is pertinent to experiencing the artworks, and I guess that experiencing the journey of the story of what is your permit through the space. We have, as I said earlier, 5 Indigenous art centres in discrete communities who have contributed works to the exhibition. Those up in the Cape, such as Hopevale and Pomperau, Wudjil and Wudjil, they have behavioural practices, avoidance behaviour practices, that requires us to have really good visibility and sight lines through the exhibition space, to also have different ways to exit the space also. Whilst at the tanks there's really one entry point and one exit point. The way to respond to those design values is to allow for exits through the space that can be easily done with other members who are to avoid looking at other family members, being able to go behind walls or move around. So in the way that the wall plan has been laid out, I've considered those values.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, I think it's interesting that it's from the perspective of indigenising the space from a cultural safety perspective, but it's also, I think what you've done is you've created a sense, and I think I said to you the first day I walked into the whole space, it's that there's something very serene, very, very safe, very quiet about it, which is not the quiet of not the quiet of a usual gallery space. There's something else here. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's saying to me, but it feels good.
Yes, and I guess what we wanted to bring to this space was a united team in installation that were aware of how important the subject was, the theming for this exhibition was. So as I worked with the installation team, and we had the tanks installation team, and then we also had the trainees from Kayaf working with us, it was important that we all shared just what this was about, and everyone had a part to play in, and how important the artworks are and how sacred they are. One of the considerations at the entry point of the exhibition was to have, I guess, in plan, I call it the spine wall of the exhibition, and then the ribs come off that. Mm-hmm. I think of a dugong, that's what it reminds me of in plan, because I'm a saltwater girl. But what that curved wall does at that entry is provide, I think, psychologically, a safe way to enter the exhibition. So if you're feeling that you just need that, like a cocoon feeling where you're following something with a gentle curve, it allows for you to do that.
The other thing about the space, when I saw it, I was just so upset that we were not going to be able to have the conversation as part of WOW in here because of that, because it was that comfortable feeling. It was also a fabulous space for us to have hosted, obviously, our conversation that we were going to do,
Yes.
but also to have hosted June Oscar and the
Yes.
conversation about the Wihiyani Utangani Women's Voices report,
Yes.
and the workshop that the young girls from Didge were going to do on the Uluru Statement
Yes.
from the Heart. It was just, it was almost a space that would have enveloped that whole conversation.
Absolutely.
For the weekend, and that's what was also so beautiful about it.
We included a yarning circle.
Yeah.
That was actually a thought that came to me as I walked around the space after installing all the artworks. I was thinking about how we could make a space for yarning, but also being aware that we had WOW.
Yep.
Doing very important talks here. And I thought, I think a yarning circle is essential.
Yep. And it would have been, and I just hope people come in and use it over the next few weeks while the exhibition. I was really impressed by the strength of the Hopewell works in the exhibition, Francoise. Can you tell us a bit about them, and in particular this one here?
The artworks from Hopewell Arts Centre are all from the elders, and they're a bunch of really special women elders in the community who hold so much knowledge, not just about their own culture, the restrictions on movement, to other rights that were stripped away from them. When I step out of my curator role and I look at these pieces, I'm really moved by what is unwritten about them. So, for instance, this piece by Wanda Gibson, titled "Where's My Permit?" is about a boyfriend of hers when she was young, who had saved his money to buy a car. She had told me that he had been working up on the tablelands as a cane cutter, and that coming from Hopeville is a long way from the tablelands, it's a few hours drive away. He had managed to save money to buy his first ute. What's written on the artwork label is, "When the superintendent heard that my boyfriend bought himself his first car ever, he walked down late in the afternoon and told him to take it out of the mission by 6 a.m, or he will be punished." There's so much not said about this piece. If you have a think about the young men today, how it's such a big deal to buy their first vehicle, and they do all sorts of things to their vehicle to put their mark on it. I think, this young man wouldn't have been any different. He would have loved, enjoyed and been so happy and joyful to have his first vehicle, to be able to take it into his community, to be able to share it with his family, for his family to enjoy going for a drive out to the nearby beach, which would take a long time to walk to. He would be able to drive them there in half an hour or so. All these unwritten narratives that could go with this short explanation, I find really, really moving. And I think of, how was he affected as a young male to have that right taken away from him? What impact did it have on his own sense of value? I think what really got me about this piece is I'm a mother. I have a 19, almost 20-year-old son who has his first vehicle, and I think of how much love he gives his car. And I thought about, being the mother of your son who had his car taken away from him and that joy taken away from his family.
And thanks for sharing that, because I know what an emotional piece that is, work that is for you and for many people who are coming in to look at them. And
for Wanda. And I'm in awe of just the courage that all these artists showed to tell their stories publicly.
The other great thing, Francoise, about the exhibition to me is that, as usual with with an exhibition that's looking at a particular thematic, a narrative, a curatorial concept, and coming from First Nation artists, is the diversity of medium material that people are using and have the ability to use to express so beautifully some of the different stories that are being told within it. So, this work I love, so please.
Yes. This work is by Frida Messina, and it's called Subjugation. These pieces are prawn traps that she's made by hand. She's made these representing the different ways that Indigenous people were controlled under the Protectionist Act. So each one is representative of a form of control. Something that Frida shared with me was that as she made these baskets, she was thinking about the life that her grandfather lived, and she was passed on this knowledge of how to make these pawn traps by her family, and they would go out and use the prawn trap to catch prawns. And so when she showed me that she would place the trap between her legs and move, kind of hit the water so that the prawns or the yabbies would end up going into the traps. And so she was showing me this. In making it, she just, because it takes so much time to make these beautiful weavings, she contemplated the life of her grandfather, who had been removed from up Hopevale Way and as a child, and basically dumped along the Mulgrave River just south of Cairns, in a spot where other children had been, half-caste children had been relocated to during that day, and they were left to fend for themselves. She spent time contemplating just how hard his life was. This exhibition gave her opportunity to truth tell her family story. Her grandfather was contacted by an anthropologist later in his later years, who had been working with the traditional owners in the Hopevale area, and he was identified as a person who had information, almost like a missing link of information that others back in the community had said he would know about. So it was a journey for this anthropologist to locate him, because he had been moved around and ended up settling and getting married and having a family and having grandkids and great-grandkids on the tablelands. because of this contact made by the anthropologist, he was able to go back on country, and what amazed her family was that he had retained all of this knowledge about the form of the land, the stories, boundary lines for different clans. He had all this information just sitting there, even though he was taken away. And he was part of celebrating with the clan when they received their native title. For Frida, she cried while producing this artwork, whilst contemplating family history. But I asked her if these were good tears, if there were good tears in it, and if thinking over this and making something with your own hands had brought some kind of healing. And she had said that, yeah, it had. She had tears in her eyes, I had tears. I think when you read more about Frida Messina and Jitter arts, you can see just how the effects of being removed, having her grandfather removed from country, has had on her life and on her creative practice. And she's a woman who wants to do things for the communities in creative practice. And she started up Jitter Arts, which is based in Innisfail, and she works with other women, and they're creating weavings and doing paintings. Art really helps in your social and emotional well-being, and this is a woman who's doing it in Innisfail. I'm very proud of her.